Hi everyone, this is Kevin Moss with the Western Governors Association. Thank you all for joining us today for a webinar about collaboration and the use of alternative dispute resolution tools in forestry and range planning. We have a great conversation lined up for you today. Our moderator today is Dan Adams, and he is joined by panelists Susan Hayman, Scott Horngren, and Paul DeMorgan. This is a follow-up conversation to a webinar from last April. And this whole webinar series has been a part of Governor Bullock of Montana's National Forestry and Range Management Initiative. So yeah, we're really excited that you all have joined us today. But first, I want to thank a number of researchers and partners who helped with the putting this webinar together. So first off, I want to thank Gail Bingham with Resolve. She was a great source of information in putting this together, and she also highly recommended Paul. A few folks from Oregon Consensus that I want to give a shout out to are Brett Brownscombe, Peter Dalkey, and Peter Harkema. And then from Schwab, I'd like to thank Jonna Davidova, Greg Fulham, and Kurt Johansson for all the research they helped us with. And then finally, I'd like to thank Brian Manwaring with the U.S. Institute for Environmental Conflict Resolution. He put us in touch with Dan Adams, so thank you, Brian. And then finally, Doug Wheeler with Hogan Levels and Peter Williams with the Partnership and Community Collaboration Academy. Hopefully a few of you are joining in today, and we are going to kick things off in a few moments, but first I want to give you some logistical information about WebEx. So if you look in the bottom of the middle part of your screen, you'll see a cloud bubble. If you go ahead and click that cloud bubble, it will enable the chat function. You can use that to send questions to me, Kevin Moss, at any point during the webinar, and I will compile our best questions and then give them to Dan for use in the moderated discussion and audience participation section. So if you send those directly to me, I'll pass them along to Dan. And now I'd like to turn it over to Troy Timmons with WGA.
Thank you, Kevin, and definitely thank everyone for taking time to join this webinar today. As Kevin mentioned, this is part of a series of webinars in support of WGA's ongoing work on land management policy. It's a follow-up to the Western Governors National Forest and Rangeland Management Initiative. One of the issues that we've explored over the course of that initiative and over the last year has been the role of litigation in affecting land management decisions. One conclusion I think we've reached is that while the present litigation environment is a significant improvement over what it was a couple of decades ago, there are still issues that remain out there. One of the reasons I think that we've determined for that improved environment is that the opportunity for public input into land use decision-making processes is much more robust than it used to be. Today, if you're interested in what's going on in your, especially on national forests, you have the opportunity to join a collaborative group, often including a lot of your neighbors, and have that very close-in opportunity to examine what is going to happen on the public lands that you live in. That's a positive thing. On the negative side, lawsuits can still frustrate forest and rangeland management efforts. They can frustrate some of that collaborative decision-making process. The topic of litigation and its potential alternatives can get pretty messy. I don't think anybody wants to eliminate citizens' ability to use the legal system to address their concerns about activities that a government may be undertaking. That's a fundamental American right. At the same time, we want to ensure that land management works, and that those activities, whether it's for species conservation or wildfire mitigation or whatever, can proceed at a responsible pace. We've already dipped our toe into the cold waters of dispute resolution processes, and I'd refer you to WGA's website if you'd like to listen to the first discussion we had on this issue. Today's webinar continues that discussion and looks at some of the issues around collaboration, more specifically, and dispute resolution processes. We've got a really solid panel lined up to tackle these issues. Our moderator today is Dan Adams. Dan leads the Langdon Group, which specializes in helping people collaboratively solve problems, and that's something we love here at WGA. He's a nationally renowned expert in collaboration, especially in situations involving environmental policy. Dan has a hard task ahead of him today, attempting to guide this discussion, but I'm pretty sure he's up for the job. I'll let Dan introduce his fellow panelists, and we really look forward to hearing of their experiences and observations on how dispute resolution processes can be improved. Dan has a great wealth of experience fostering partnerships, including the partnership with our panelists today, and we're fortunate that he's guiding this conversation. So Dan, at this point I'll hand the reins over to you and let you guide the rest of this discussion. Thanks.
Sounds good. Thanks, Troy. Okay, well, yeah, we're all excited as well. I think these opportunities don't come up very often to be able to talk about the work we're doing and the work that so many of you are doing as well. And so this is really exciting. What I'll do is I'm going to give time to Scott Horngren, and then Paul DeMorgan, and then Susan Hayman, and they'll do a brief 5-minute introduction, talk a little bit about the work they do and introduce themselves a little bit. And then after the three of them go through them, I'll say just a little bit about the work that I'm doing and type any other points there. And then after the four of us give those brief intros, we'll move into our moderated discussion. So, okay, Scott, do you want to go ahead and kick us off and talk about your work a little bit?
Yeah, a little bit about my background. I have a degree in forest management from Oregon State. I also have a law degree and have been practicing law for 30 years in the environmental field, involving BLM plans and projects and Forest Service plans and projects, representing counties, timber owners, ranchers, farmers, and I'm currently an attorney with the Western Resources Legal Center in Portland, and we run a clinical class in environmental litigation at the school from the perspective of ranchers, farmers, timber people, and students that are interested in that. Just briefly, we're going to touch on a number of different alternative dispute resolution processes this morning: mediation, arbitration, negotiation, collaboration, some hybrids, and all of those may have varying definitions, but the agencies are looking to ADR processes as an alternative to litigation, as Troy mentioned. And as we go through the discussion, some of these approaches can work better in different contexts, and two things to think about when considering the opportunities for using these ADR techniques are the type of action you're trying to apply them to and the timing in the decision-making process. And by type of action, I mean some of these may fit better in the land management, landscape, broad planning process, and some may be more compatible with developing individual projects like timber sales, grazing decisions, recreation projects, and wildlife habitat improvement projects. And then as far as the timing, you know, we're dealing with before decisions are made where, you know, something like a collaboration, I think, is designed to try to work to develop that decision versus after the final agency decision. You know, mediation may be inappropriate or more difficult there. Arbitration may fit better there than before the decision is made. Just a brief highlight of the types of ADR. We've got the mediation. Usually third parties are involved in that to try to facilitate people. We've got some great ones on the phone today. Sometimes I've been involved in just negotiations between the parties. The environmental groups and the ranchers or the timber people get together after an appeal is filed to try to resolve it, or even after litigation is filed without any third party neutral per se guiding those discussions. You know, you have collaboration in the statutes. They mention a collaborative process or a collaborative, and sometimes the agencies are involved in those. Other times the agency wants the public to, you know, form its own collaborative and move forward. Arbitration is usually a question of whether it's binding, a decision by the arbitrator, or non-binding. And to my knowledge, none of these processes are mandatory for an agency to use in decision making, but the collaborative process is available and an option under the Healthy Forest Restoration Act and Farm Bill amendments for developing certain landscape fuel reduction and insect and disease problems. And so if you use this collaborative process for developing those types of projects, you're eligible for some streamlined NEPA, like only considering a few alternatives or using a categorical exclusion rather than an EIS or an EA. Collaboration and collaborative process is also part of the Forest Service's collaborative forest landscape restoration projects and programs. There's a few of those throughout the West. And then lastly, I'd like to conclude on a recent piece of legislation. In fact, there was a hearing on it introduced by Senators Daines of Montana and Risch and Crapo of Idaho, involving arbitration as a pilot project in Region 1 of the Forest Service for challenge to final decisions. The bill is S-2160, and basically it would apply and be available for hazardous fuel reduction and insect and disease projects that were developed through a collaborative project. The pilot can apply to 2 projects a year. It's considered an alternative to litigation, and the arbitrator would consider the Forest Service decision and any of those that invoked the arbitration process's proposal, and the legislation requires the Forest Service or the arbitrator to choose one or the other, and or neither. They can't make a compromise, if you will. And then lastly, the Forest Service testified at the hearing last week in support of this legislation, and I'll pass it on to the next panelist.
Great, thanks, Scott. Very good. Paul, do you want to go ahead and give us your background?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, this is Paul DeMorgan. I'm a senior mediator at Resolve, which is a dispute resolution consensus building organization based in Washington, D.C. However, I've worked for most of my career out in the West. I live in Logan, Utah at the moment, and previously lived in Portland, Oregon. And before that, worked out of Colorado. We do, much like Dan and Susan, and to maybe some extent Scott, we do a whole range of different kind of work on a whole range of different processes in the space, kind of along the lines of what Scott was talking about. I do a lot of facilitation work where mediation then becomes part of the kind of the toolkit, if you will, to help a group achieve what its common objectives are. So spend time managing the meetings and organizing and really trying to set the table for the participants to have the conversations they need to have to reach decisions, or at least have the opportunity to reach decisions. We also do a lot of strategic planning, not in a classical develop a strategic plan, but working with groups about strategically how to plan for, for instance, does some kind of formal facilitation, mediation, dispute resolution process make sense, doing kind of an assessment of the situation for them. And we also do a lot, have transitioned over the last maybe 10 years or so to doing a lot of initiation of collaboratives, if you will, where we kind of, through our relationships with people, identify kind of some key issues, often related to natural resources, but we also do a lot of work in the health arena, where we kind of encourage parties to get together and find the funding that they need to, have to kind of move through the process that they've identified. One of the, a brief example of that is we've done quite a bit of work in Africa related to two different kind of threads of work. One related to conflict minerals and pulling together a number of technology companies from around the world who need those minerals for the work they do, but didn't want to source from conflict zones, and creating, mechanisms for them to be able to source conflict-free minerals. We've also done a lot of work with biodiversity management, kind of human-wildlife conflict issues in Africa, and bringing together, state agencies, as well as local farmers and local communities to address those human-wildlife conflicts. Not necessarily directly related to the subjects that most of us here work on, but those are kind of some examples of the type of work that we've done in that vein. I've spent a lot of time over the last 10 years working on one particular project that I think has significant relevancy to this, though not on the rangeland front by any means, but facilitating something called the Missouri River Recovery Implementation Committee, which is a congressionally mandated group that actually has a FACA exemption, and we can talk about that later if people are interested. But it basically, the Corps manages the Missouri River to address a whole slew or to meet the needs of a whole slew of authorized purposes, including flood control, power generation, water supply, recreation, as well as now and over the last maybe 15, 20 years, having to manage it to deal with some endangered species, pallid sturgeon and piping plover in particular. And so a group of stakeholders, about 28 stakeholders representing 16 different interests that were identified at the beginning of the process, along with 8 states, about 15 federal agencies, and up to, maybe between 10 and 28, depending, tribes, meet on a quarterly basis and then often in between to try to develop recommendations for the Corps and Fish and Wildlife Service on how they can balance the variety of interests. And mediation, facilitation comes in significant, is a major part of what we provide in those situations, as well as strategic advice to the agencies, but also the stakeholders about how they can, have their interests met, but also other, get a solution that also meets the interests of the other parties. And that one's a pretty, as you can imagine, with that number of parties and that number of interests, can get pretty complicated. As it relates to the issue, or at least one of the threads in this webinar, how does, there's been questions about, does that help to strengthen against litigation from outside parties? And as I was saying to a few folks before the webinar started, unfortunately, no, it doesn't stop others from outside that group or the stakeholder, even outside the stakeholder communities they immediately represent, from engaging in litigation. And that litigation comes at the core and at the overall effort from all sides, but the inherent benefit from the committee, I'd say, is at least twofold. One is the relationships that are established in that committee, both at the meeting and then away from the table, are significant, so that when litigation arises, people who are frustrated by that have avenues into the communities where the litigation is coming from to better understand why it's being initiated, and to try through the committee to help address those issues. Once it gets into the legal world, it's obviously not the committee's role to kind of really jump in and play any formal role, but informally they're able to influence and inform how those efforts unfold, I guess is what I'd say. So that's just a little bit about me and my organization and one big project that I've been working on that may have some relevance to this overall topic. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Paul. Very good. Okay, Susan, you're up.
All right. Thank you very much, Dan, and hello, everyone. And I'm really appreciate the opportunity to be part of the panel, and it's exciting and always something I love to talk about is collaboration, alternative dispute, and the use of collaboration as a really helpful alternative dispute resolution tool. So just a little bit about me. I am a senior associate and also senior facilitator at a company called Enviroissues that is based in Seattle. I've actually been located in Seattle for about 2.5 years, was previously in Boise, and that's actually where I met Dan, was when we were both in Boise. Prior to being with Enviroissues, I had my own practice, a facilitation practice, and really worked throughout the Intermountain West on project work as well as some national work that would take me back to DC. And before I was a private practitioner, I actually have this previous life where I worked for the Forest Service. I started out as a field-going range conservationist and was on the business end of a shovel and a Pulaski at times, kind of went through into public affairs, ended up as a forest NEPA coordinator and appeals and litigation specialist. And it was really at that point where I decided that I was more interested in trying to help people resolve conflict than I was in winning disputes. And that has really been just the focus of my career since. I work both interagency and with the public. Almost all of my work at Enviroissues is involved in natural resources, principally with the public agencies, the Forest Service, the BLM, Fish and Wildlife Service, USGS are the agencies that I work the most with. And similar to what Paul said, I really view my role as oftentimes being the person that helps set the table to bring those varied interests together and to try to help those people who bring their interests and their backgrounds and all their experience to finding ways where they can find some areas of agreement on some things. So I work on travel management planning for the Forest Service. I've done some of that with the BLM as well. Forest plan revisions. I've worked a lot on sagebrush conservation and sage grouse, greater sage grouse conservation planning. So have that background as well. The things that you will probably hear from me most about today on the webinar really are about building collaborative capacity. I really love working in communities and also with agencies in trying to reach that place where there's some trust built and some interest sharing, and that whatever decision that we might be working on at the moment, those relationships carry over to the next decision that comes down the road. I think that's really important. I'm very interested in where there are areas of agreement. I think we sometimes get very tripped up on consensus, and I'm really interested in trying to identify where people are in agreement and where we can move on that, and then where those sticking points are and where we might be able to do a little bit more work. Third, I'm really interested in creating durable decisions, and I think you'll hear about that from all of us. being able to believe that I can say to people it's worth investing in collaboration as a way to resolve conflict before a decision, so that once a decision is made, that decision can uphold being challenged. Have had some success in that, either that I have personally experienced or witnessed. There's a travel management project on the Cibola National Forest that was really successful, ended up not being even appealed, which was almost unheard of in the Forest Service. Have some fairly recent decisions on the Boise and the Idaho Panhandle National Forest around restoration work that were successful in court because of the collaboration that preceded. So very interested in that, and just how bringing in neutral conveners and people engaged with the process throughout might be helpful in getting conflict to a place that you won't be challenged down the road. So that's really what I'm hoping to bring to the conversation, and really look forward to engaging with everyone.
Great, perfect. All right, thank you, Scott, Paul, and Susan. That was perfect. Great way to start us off. I'm going to do a very brief intro of myself, and then I'm going to talk about a little bit about some of the common themes that we've been hearing and seeing. I think a lot of these common themes have been things that Western Governors has also been hearing, and also hearing in the previous webinar series as well. And then we can then start talking about some of these different ideas and open up to the panel. So I've been doing this work for 21 years. I started doing this work in Oregon, in Central Oregon. I come from a natural resources and a ranching family background. When I first started mediating conflicts, what I started seeing was a lot of times when we do mediation, it seems like there's always these core principles, or there was key themes that kept coming up, and it seemed like I could mediate a conflict, but the odds are that I'd be back, or somebody else would be back mediating that same conflict again in the future. So I early on became really interested in how do we systemically look at these problems and flesh out the root causes of these problems. So I did a master's in organizational behavior to kind of help me with that. And then I worked actually for Resolve back in DC back in the day, and I worked in Oregon, Colorado, and Idaho, and then I've been in Utah for the last 11 years. And I've been running the Langdon Group for the last 15 years, and there's 18 of us, and we're a subsidiary of an engineering company called JUB Engineers. So some of the current projects I'm working on right now is, and I bring this up mainly because I think important part, whenever I work with agency executives, one of the common questions we always get asked is, where do you go for, for these resources? If you're looking for a third party or outside help, where do you go? And the Department of Interior has an IDIQ, which is a federal contracting mechanism, through an office in Washington, D.C. called the Collaborative Action and Dispute Resolution Office, CADR is what it's often referred to. So the Department of Interior has this CADR contract, which has a list of approved practitioners, and the EPA also has an IDIQ contract also. And so a lot of the work we do is through those two contracts. One of the projects I have coming up on that will be the Wild Horse and Burro working group for the Department of Interior and BLM. I'll be facilitating that working group in October. We're also helping the Manti-La Sal National Forest with their forest plan revision, and which is a little more interesting since the Bears Ears is within that forest footprint. And specifically in that project, I'm working a lot with tribes. I'm also working on a term permit renewal for the BLM in what's called Wilson Creek in Nevada, and this involves the Southern Nevada Water Authority and 8 different permittees that have grazing permits there. That involves wild horses and sage grouse and water and a lot of those different things. And another one of these tools or mechanisms that's available is called Oregon Consensus. This is based out of Portland State University. if any agencies have any challenges or conflicts in Oregon, that is another great resource, is Oregon Consensus. And we're doing some work with them on targeted grazing, and I worked with them a fair amount with the Hayman case before the Bundys came in there. And then I'm also working with ITD on some interesting environmental studies in Island Park that involve animal vehicle collisions and tribes and NGOs and other agencies. So in doing this work, the big thing that I think all four of us could talk about are some of these common themes that we hear all the time. Some of those themes are that people in natural resource projects that work for agencies are often in an acting role, or they're on a detail, or you start making great progress in collaboration and one of your key folks goes on a 120-day detail. But that challenge of having so many people in the agencies that are in, the federal agencies that are in either an acting or in a detail role. The thing we hear all the time too is about range con turnover. It seems like places that collaboration is going well, a common theme we hear is that, gosh, it's working well because I have a really great range con and we communicate often and we have mutual understanding. But then that range con goes and then they get somebody fresh out of school and they start that whole process of kind of training each other all over again. The other thing that we hear everywhere throughout the West is that everybody is looking for the smoking gun of government overreach, which is so fascinating because a lot of times when I talk to people that are really spun up and fired up about government overreach, I'll ask them about how it's going locally for them. They'll say, oh yeah, my relationship with my range con is great. It's working really good. But I heard that in such and such state that this issue is going on. I think that was kind of a big thing about the Hayman-Bundy situation in Oregon, was that a lot of people were able to say, see, there we go, there's our smoking gun. Another thing too is about constraints on time. It seems like this part about time, about timeliness of decisions being made, or how long it's been since a decision has been made, but those issues of time are really big. The other thing too is that a lot of people, it seems like a lot of agents or permittees, whether it's people in timber, mining, or grazing, that a lot of times they feel like they are not understood. Or what causes people to go to litigation is that they feel like somewhere in the NEPA process or planning process that they weren't fully understood. Another thing I think that makes all this stuff even more challenging is the 24-hour news cycle and social media. People really do want to have a voice, and they have so many avenues to express an opinion or express a voice. It's kind of interesting. One of the things we hear all the time is that, ranchers, as an example, have arguably never been as successful as they have been the last 10 years as far as making a profit and doing well. But yet that group has probably never been as stressed out as they are right now. And so it's kind of this interesting thing about why do we have stakeholders that are so stressed out and that come into a collaboration with already sometimes so stuck in a position that is sometimes very value-laden or very value-laden with what they feel are rights. And a lot of that, I think, comes from that stress. And one last thing, and then I'll end here, is this part about adaptive management and flexibility tied to rangeland and range management, and a lot of issues that face the Forest Service and the BLM are that there's these policies that come and then people are told that, hey, let's utilize adaptive management, and within that you can find flexibility. But even if people are working well with their local agency, there's a concern that if that local agency folks change or there's turnover, will they lose adaptive management, and then will they lose flexibility? So a lot of anxiety about that. So the first question, turn over to our panelists here, is, are there any other common themes that you three are seeing that would help frame our discussion about alternative dispute resolution tools?
Dan, this is Susan, and I think one other theme, and would be interesting to, if anyone has any thoughts on this, is just the expectations that we come into these processes with. Again, I feel that sometimes we're trying to, or we set ourselves up to try to solve all the disputes, to resolve all the conflict, and it may be that if we can triage that a little bit, there might be some higher order interests or conflicts that we may be able to get to that can go a long way towards bringing people along on those other items. So I do think that just the expectations people have for collaboration or ADR processes is important.
Very good. Yeah, sometimes those expectations can be confusing, wondering what are the tools or what the resources are as well, right? Go ahead, is that you, Paul?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I was just going to say another theme here that might be interesting to kind of tease out a little bit more at some point is, you know, for these ultimately to be successful, you know, I often find you need to take the time up front to set a strong foundation, establish, build trust, which you can't do just at the snap of a finger usually. I guess it'd be two fingers, right? But you do really have to, you know, to enable a group to be successful both in terms of planning for and then reaching some agreements, and then longer term having those agreements withstand external or other kind of some of the challenges you've talked about, people leaving, et cetera. You really need to build that strong foundation. And that takes time, and sometimes there's time pressures to get things done that don't allow you to do that, and then it weakens the whole process. And so, you know, it's one of the benefits often that I find, and that I think people that we've worked with find, is, you know, having a third party or kind of facilitator or some kind of individual come in and do an assessment, which includes engaging some of those other stakeholders and letting them understand that whole suite of kind of challenges and ways to overcome them, development of operating principles, et cetera, is a useful tool. But regardless, you just can't, you know, there's only so much time, and you need to, time builds the trust, or trust is only built over time, I guess I would say, and sometimes that's a challenge when, you know, you've got to have an agreement in 2 months or something like that, you know, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good. Yeah, no doubt tying those two thoughts together, Susan and Paul, tied to expectations that people have, and then that part of being able to have trust, but then also having the constraints of time. There's no doubt about being explicit about what that is up front, and through an assessment is a great way to do that. Yeah, no kidding. Those are big constraints and big challenges. Paul, is there anything you want to add about something that you have done to help you to build that trust more quickly?
One thing that I was just thinking about is, you know, it's nice, and it's obviously every situation is different, as anyone would attest, but it's nice if you can try to find opportunities for agreements, tangible results early in the process. And so if you're able, and sometimes it's resource constraint, sometimes it's time constraint, but if you're able to do an assessment of the situation, trying to find not only the difficult issues that the group is likely to struggle with, but also maybe some issues where the group might be able to get some early wins or some early, you know, as I said, tangible results, is a nice way to try to start to build that trust. Again, you know, often in these kinds of agreements, especially, you know, you started talking about adaptive management, maybe that's a kind of a different tangent, but often, you know, even short-term results, you know, are predicated on long-term implementation, and, you know, the trust has to be built over time, because yes, we reached an agreement, but is the agency or are the other stakeholders actually adhering to holding up their end of the agreement? And that is obviously something that takes a little time. But that's one mechanism or one tool that I've used or like to try to look for is those early tangible results.
Great. Maybe I'll share a quick one too. I think one of the things I've been intrigued by for a long time is how do we build trust quickly, especially when the stakes are high, but also how do you do it when people have been really deeply entrapted in a conflict for a long time? It seems like when they have been involved in a conflict for a long time, whenever you come in as a facilitator or maybe there's a renewed passion from the agency to solve a problem, whenever the words moving forward or next steps or in the future, those things seem like they are matches to gas. That there's certain stakeholders that just they're stuck and they can't move forward. And the one thing I would share, I have a quick example in a range conflict in Nevada, and I had a permittee that those words just always increase the conflict. But what I found was that this individual, her story had not been, she hadn't felt like her story had been heard. And she didn't feel like the agencies had heard the story either. So I went to her ranch and sat down at her dining room table, pulled up my laptop and said, okay, I'm gonna write your story. You dictate it to me and I'll write it. And so we started at 10 in the morning and we ended about 11 o'clock that night. And then I left the draft with her and I went to back to my hotel, came back at 7:30 the next morning. She had a bunch of edits made and we went for another 5 hours. But until she felt like her story had really been heard, there was no way we could move forward. And so I think a big element of this stuff is how do you authentically go and spend the time to help people to really feel that their story has been heard. And that's, I think, a principle of mediation that you always have is telling the story. But yet, it seems like a lot of these projects we work on do not involve so much traditional mediation. Panelists, maybe could you guys share a little bit of your thoughts about what are you seeing that's maybe beyond traditional mediation or traditional arbitration that you're seeing in your work? Maybe, Scott, if you want to start us off. Scott, we may have you on mute. I can't hear you there.
Are you there?
There we go. There we go. We can hear you now.
Okay, they got there. Okay, I think this recent legislation introduced for Montana and Region 1 is sort of an indication of the frustration that the Forest Service, some of the people that use resources on the Forest Service have with being able to move forward with the process once collaboration and mediation are over. And, a broader question is, is legislation or certain features of legislation appropriate to support mediation, collaboration, and the permanence of the outcome of that process? And so I think it's going to be interesting to watch to see what happens to this legislation. One of the elements of it is it has an incentive for people to participate in a collaborative because it provides that you have a door into the arbitration if you, and this is a quote from the legislation, participated in the applicable collaborative process. And I know there are certain groups that sit on the sidelines and don't want to be involved in collaboratives because they don't want to see commercial activity on the public lands, and this might give them an incentive to participate.
Excellent. That is really good. That's interesting also that's tied to legislation and that state is taking the leadership stance on that. That's very good. Paul, anything that you would want to share?
Sure. I'm not 100% certain this quite tracks directly with your question, but it's something you said earlier about adaptive management I did want to tease out just a little bit. The Missouri River Project is planning on, and they have an independent science advisory panel who said, really to be successful, you need a very strong adaptive management program driven by hypotheses and then experiments and actions that assess whether those hypotheses will bear out, and if not, how to adapt, et cetera, kind of a classical adaptive management process. Unfortunately, and there are lots of strengths behind adaptive management, been a strong supporter of that kind of model for a long time. Unfortunately, as you kind of alluded to, I think, but is that adaptive management means flexibility, but it also means lack of certainty. And stakeholders often, and agencies for that matter, Fish and Wildlife Service in that particular instance, are concerned with the lack of certainty, both from a regulatory perspective, but also from a on the ground decision-making perspective if you're a stakeholder. So they haven't decided, therefore, to get rid of adaptive management, but what they are creating is, I think, according to many of the independent science folks that are involved, maybe something that's never been done, at least at this scale before, but is collaborative adaptive management governance, where the stakeholder community is intimately involved in all of the decisions within the adaptive management process. Now, obviously, the agencies aren't giving up their decision-making authority in that in this model, but they are allowing and enabling and supporting the stakeholders' full engagement in the governance of the adaptive management program. So, from looking at the studies and understanding the results that are coming in to adapting or making recommendations on the strategic plan for the next 5 years, which is updated every year. And to me, it's a really interesting, with many kind of potential pitfalls, both building it and implementing it as we look forward. But a really interesting opportunity to allow the stakeholder community to understand why decisions are being made and to play a role in having those decisions made.
Very good. If for those that would like to learn more about that, if you just Google University Network for Collaborative Governance, you can find a lot of additional information about that and kind of the efforts going around the country. Thanks, Paul. Susan, anything you want to add about what you're seeing for non-traditional and what is it looking like in your practice?
Sure, and actually, let me just mention something on the heels of what Paul just said, and then tying back maybe to where Scott started us here. But that idea of allowing a collaborative group to be present and be able to watch and engage in a process, not only throughout the whole process and pre-decision, but once the decision is made, I just think that's such a powerful way to build that trust and build that collaborative capacity. I just cannot believe that that's going to do anything except be helpful in that regard. And so many times we see agencies engage in a process of even a really highly controversial kind of project, and they might bring in some kind of a collaborative group, but they just drop them in at maybe one part of the process, like maybe before they actually start NEPA, and then they almost disband them later. So I think the idea of being able to pull a group through and keep them engaged, as Paul described, is really powerful and would be a great ADR tool. The other thing just quickly to mention, and this might be a little bit more on Scott's end of things, is I haven't been involved in this way, but I have advocated for it, and that's to bring in neutrals in the objection process. That's the Forest Service's administrative process. It used to be appeals, now it's an objection process. And I find that, a decision is made, an objection is filed, and then the agencies go have those conversations with the people who are challenging them. And I personally think that is a big challenge, because you might get into a conversation on the objection process. you might resolve somebody's issue, but then you may have just raised a whole bunch of new issues with people that weren't in the room. So I think bringing in a neutral, whoever that is, would be a really powerful way to help think about and navigate through successfully the Forest Service's objection process.
All right, very good. Very good. Kevin, can you pull up slide number 2?
Yeah, sure thing.
Okay. Well, Kevin's pulling this up. Actually, there we go. So, yep, that'll do. So on this slide, I do think one of the things I keep learning is the longer I do this work is a lot of these things are just taking things that are tacit and making them explicit. A lot of times in NEPA, it requires public involvement, public engagement. But what I'm finding is a lot of times what a specific project is asking for public involvement, that really they're looking for help and engagement at different levels as well. So this is a model we created to kind of help frame this up. So the bottom, we call it the 5 Ps model. So the bottom P is public. That's the public at large, the people we invite to public hearings, open houses. We go and engage in assessment that Paul talked about earlier. We try to keep them informed and involved throughout the entire process. The second P is project. So these are from each agency, whether it's a local government, state government, or federal government, it's whomever they send to engage in a collaborative process. The third P is program or program management. So, the EPA has the NEPA program, or they have a 404 program, or each agency has all these different programs, and depending on the type of project or planning or NEPA, they're going to have different program management involved. The fourth P is policy, and by this what we mean is political appointees or agency leaders. So Region 8 of the EPA, it would be the administrator. For Forest Service, Region 4, it would be the forest supervisor, or the regional forester, I guess, would be more accurate. But also the regional forester would be that maybe at the forest level. And then the top P, the political, these are the elected officials. This is the president, it's the legislator, it's the county commissioner, it's the mayor, it's the city council. So this idea of the dashed line from public to political is because they're the ones that elect them. So if you switch to the next slide there, Kevin. So this idea here is that when we talk about collaboratives, or we talk about working together with others, we have to make sure that there's horizontal and vertical communication, collaboration taking place. Where I've seen a lot of these collaboratives fall apart is when you'll have maybe the regional office in Seattle, let's say, but the EPA is engaging in Idaho from a local office. And then maybe that collaborative comes to some type of an agreement or ideas on how to solve a problem, but then that DC office or the regional office or whatever says, nope, hey, we would never have agreed to that, and the collaboration can fall apart. And so the idea here is that we make sure that throughout the collaborative process, all 5 Ps are vertically engaged, that everybody knows from top to bottom what is going on and is up to speed, but then also horizontal. So in this case, I have the Utah Department of Transportation, Army Corps of Engineers, EPA, and Salt Lake City as my examples. And what we see a lot is that people are not explicit about who the individuals are at each of those levels. Sometimes when I've been asked to come in and facilitate where a collaborative process has gone to heck, and I'll write this out and say, okay, help me understand who are the people at each of these levels, and are they communicating? I once did this, and I did 27 interviews, and I had 27 different versions filled out. So I think key to a lot of this stuff is making sure that we are taking tacit, making explicit about who the people are, at what levels, when we're doing engagements. So I guess the question I would ask for our panelists is, in collaborative efforts that you've been a part of, what were the key factors, both positive or negative, that impacted the group's success? or if you have any thoughts you want to throw in about this 5 Ps model.
So this is Susan. I would just say as far as collaborative groups and what were some of the things that I think helped them be successful, I think the first one is giving them an opportunity to really understand each other's interests. So not having them state their position about things, but overall just being able to share what brings them to this project, where their interests lie. We often find, especially on with federal lands and on federal projects, that there is no way to get all of the potential stakeholders or organizations in the room. So if we can be sure that we've got all the interests there, even if geographically we can't get every organization there, I think it helps the group to then feel that everyone who needs to be at the table or those interests are at the table, and that's a really important place, for them to start, is to do that. I guess the other thing I would say is kind of going to maybe starting with the easy wins that Paul mentioned earlier. This isn't necessarily easy, but being able to just try to get some agreement about the criteria you might use to make a recommendation before you jump right into what's the recommendation, I have found to be extremely helpful in getting some positive agreement and movement with collaborative groups.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point about interest, and those interests sometimes can vary at different levels within a given agency, can't they?
Absolutely.
So sometimes, yeah, getting those fleshed out early on and then throughout. Yeah, very good. Scott or Paul, any other thoughts you want to share?
This is Paul. I could share on the kind of what impacts success. I mean, these are, maybe not groundbreaking or earth-shaking kind of comments here, but, the support, getting and having and maintaining the support of leadership within whatever agency is, if it's being driven by an agency, is really essential, or at least really impacts the likelihood of success at the very least. I mean, there are instances where it is, folks who maybe kind of more kind of line level folks who are suggesting the kind of process, but without leadership support. So I'll, a couple of examples. In Utah right now, the director of the Division of Water Quality strongly believes in the value of a collaborative effort to address water quality on a lake here in Utah, and has committed both resources and her time to engaging with the stakeholder, the range of stakeholders, both at the kind of policy level in terms of impacts to on-the-ground users, as well as at the scientific level with the independent science advisory group that's been formed. And that commitment, as those of you that work for somebody else or have a boss know, that influences your level of commitment, or, I'm not saying it always drives it, but it definitely influences it in terms of level of effort, level of energy, level of willingness to try to make things work. As a facilitator, I think you want to be able to foster that commitment, that support from the leaders as much as possible throughout the process, by kind of showing them how things are working, where things are working, not that they can't see that themselves, but highlighting from your kind of neutral perspective some of the benefits in an ongoing way. I think, one of the challenges for lots of these efforts is again, not earth-shattering here, but, the external forces that are minimizing the importance or attempting to delegitimize a process even before it gets started. And, trying to figure out how many or how to manage that side of any equation is always an important piece. you know, bringing it, to the extent possible, somebody into the tent as opposed to leaving them outside is obviously a classic way to try to do that. But even if you can't bring those people in, then having, you know, still trying to reach out, still trying to include them, you know, through public involvement, et cetera, is another mechanism to try to kind of move that forward.
Excellent. Very good. Scott, anything you'd want to add to that?
Nothing to add at this point.
Okay. One thing I want to make sure we cover on this this webinar is about collaborations. There are some very successful collaborations. Oregon and some in Idaho right now, there's some really great examples of collaborations that have been going for quite some time. And the attributes of those collaborations, I think, are very important because they touch on a lot of things that our panelists have talked about being able to take the time, being able to have the funding to take the time. There's one of the examples that I think is really great is the Harney County Restoration Collaborative, which is there in Burns. And that collaborative has been going for quite some time. And as I've met with members of that collaborative and talked to them about how they've been so successful, especially with very, very different interests involved in that group, what everybody will tell you is that they first spent their time developing relationships, getting to know each other, and they did it especially by getting out on the ground and looking at the issues on the ground together, listening and hearing each other's stories. And then they also didn't take the bait of looking for a project or problem to solve until they had first developed the relationships. That once they did, then they actively sought projects together. The Forest Service in this case, the district ranger there, she shared with me that she had a 40,000-acre timber sale and a 40,000-acre grazing allotment that EAs for both, and both were completed in under 10 months with no litigation, which is amazing. But wondering if our panelists have any other thoughts about collaboratives and attributes of collaboratives that you've seen or facilitated that are there some lessons learned that you would want to share?
I think a collaborative, sometimes there will be different segments, different interests out there that will look at collaboratives and collaborative groups and feel that they're very, like an exclusive club. And so I think one thing that really helps collaboratives be successful is if there's some kind of an iteration between them and the public. So if the public is engaged and almost always is or should be in decisions and are weighing in, that information iterates back to the collaborative and how the collaborative thinks about that, and you know, maybe how they would respond to that or recommend that agencies respond to that tangibly, and then that information gets fed back to the public. So I think it's for collaboratives to be successful and to have duration and credibility, they need to also be able to be responsive to other things being raised in the public and not to appear to be just this very exclusive group.
Excellent. So avoiding perceptions of exclusivity then, is that right, Susan?
Yes, yep.
Good, good.
I've got I mean, it's something I've alluded to, but in both the Missouri River project and the recent Utah project I've been working on, they have had, and it's a resource, obviously, at some level, resource-dependent tool, but they've been able to bring to bear independent scientists to help answer some of the questions which the stakeholder community by itself can't answer, and the agency folks who are involved might be able to answer, but the stakeholder community doesn't necessarily have the same level of trust of them as they do for an independent panel. And so bringing those independent panels together, allowing the stakeholders and the agency folks who are obviously stakeholders as well to collectively, A, choose those people, which we've been able to do at some level, and B, define what those independent panel members are striving to address through questions that are collectively developed. And then using the results of those independent panel deliberations in moving forward. So I already alluded to the adaptive management piece. In the Missouri River, there already was an adaptive management program in place, and so the independent panelists, when they came in, they weren't kind of creating new language for the stakeholder community. Rather, they were changing the way in which adaptive management was being implemented. And at that point, the agency, to their credit, that the stakeholder community developed a recommendation to, basically to the agencies that said, implement these recommendations that you just got from the independent panel, that we just got from the independent panel. And to their credit, the agency did undertake that and has embarked on now going on 7-year process to, implement, and, it's been modified by that collaborative AM governance aspect that I mentioned earlier. But that certainly has been a useful tool that's, accomplished a lot in terms of building relationships, building trust, and helping, creatively to figure a way out of, difficult situations where there's a lack of trust.
This is Scott. One of the successful things, or one of the, I guess, attributes of a successful collaboration is if it survives the litigation. And one of the things I think that we've seen over the last probably 5 years is putting the collaborative or having the collaborative involved in the litigation to sort of put their money where their mouth is and support the project if it is a result of collaboration and then is attacked through litigation. And on the Mount Hood, the Colville National Forest, the Flathead National Forest, some of the collaboratives have joined together with counties and, ranching timber folks to file an amicus brief in support of the project before the court or to actually intervene in the litigation. And I think that has some influence on the judge in terms of whether he or she is inclined to uphold the project that the collaborative spent, the years working on.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
Hey, Dan.
Yeah.
And if people wanted some evidence of that Scott just mentioned, I'm actually looking at court decisions on both the tower restoration project and also the Pioneer Fire restoration projects. And in those documents, those court documents, part of the decision was based on the collaboration that occurred, and they're specifically called out in those decisions. So I think there's some really great evidence that you really can create more durable decisions, and your collaboratives can contribute greatly to that.
Very good point. I started just doing some straw polling with BLM and Forest Service folks specific to range issues and trying to flesh out where there are some themes of what people thought could help resolve rangeland conflict. And one of my assumptions was that if rangeland improvement projects were taking place, were there fewer conflicts in those areas? And the feedback I got was resoundingly yes, that where there are rangeland improvement projects taking place on the ground, the level of conflict decreases significantly. And I think tied to some of these ideas like you guys are talking about with collaborative decision making, but also where you have participants engaging in the actual implementation and problem solving, I think that it's like good, better, best. Best is if we can come to collaborative decisions, but gosh, if we can go into implementation like you were talking about with Missouri River, Paul, it just seems like once people can see that they're working together to actually implement, it seems like the game changes, you know, things get better. Any other thoughts you guys want to share about how to actually get to buildable solutions? I think maybe, Susan, this ties a little bit to one of your top three about durable decisions too, but are there some other attributes you guys are seeing about what to actually get to improvements getting built and actionable solutions, I guess? Any other ideas on how we get there quicker?
I'm waiting for Scott because I know he's going to have some ideas. So, you know, so I'm just standing by.
All right, Scott, pressure's on you. You got to deliver for Susan here.
Nothing here.
Well, I'll share.
Throw this open for audience questions.
Yeah, in fact, Kevin, I don't see any of those audience questions coming up. Do you have some there that you want to share with us?
Yeah, we've gotten a couple. I sent you that one about having someone come in who may not be local and how that plays into the trust with the local community. Did you see that one?
I did not.
Yeah, I just saw that. Can I, this is Paul, can I jump in on your earlier question, Dan, just briefly? And I'm going to, somebody, Tom Schultz in the box has written about, written a little story, I guess, about kind of a Forest Service situation where there's a lot of lawsuits, et cetera. And I don't know the situation, et cetera. But, you know, at the end he says, need to make policymakers aware of extent of the litigation problem before we can get support for reform. So, I mean, I think that's very likely a good outcome, or not outcome, but interpretation there. But, I mean, I think what it's piqued in me as I read that, and I think it goes to your point. I mean, I obviously, earlier I talked about how leadership in these collaborations needs to be involved and supportive of it. But obviously there's leadership at a whole variety of levels. And I think one thing, and this goes for all the stakeholders and all of the, you know, the convener if it is an agency, but all of the stakeholders, is it's not sufficient to have the group at the table reach an agreement and expect that it's not often, I should say, maybe, that it's going to be implemented exactly as that group in and of itself has seen it or envisioned it. There's so many people often that people represent away from the table that aren't going through that experience, that don't build the relationships. And so it's essential that you encourage, if not mandate / require, all of the parties at the table to be going back on a regular basis to inform. And you as a group can collectively develop the messaging that you want to send back, or not. You can just do it individually. But somehow you have to go back and really build an understanding among your decision makers, if you will, other people in your organization, if you want to build the strongest solution or the strongest agreement possible that is more likely to withstand, both in terms of just getting it implemented in the first place, but then also in terms of being able to withstand any kind of critiques and legal cases and stuff. Often those other individuals can identify things and flag things that maybe the group hasn't been thinking about. You know, a different set of eyes can often be helpful. I think on the second question about navigating, bringing someone in to assist and have these conversations when there's a distrust of the agency and anyone they bring in, it's a really good point. I mean, I think often what I will say at the beginning of when we're being asked to come in is, who's going to make the decision about who to bring in? And often in these long, it's kind of a chicken and egg at some level. Often with some of these longer standing collaboratives, if they're looking to bring somebody new in, or there's a particular issue that they want to bring somebody in to help them with, there's an executive committee or steering group or whatever that can do some interviews. But we often will encourage and recommend that, depending on the level of kind of anxiety along the lines of what's being described there, that the decision on who to bring in is a collaborative one, if at all possible. If that isn't possible, or the agency, the collaborative doesn't exist, we use the assessment process as a separate step from the facilitation process, so that you get brought in, and basically as you develop ground rules, you say at the beginning that while we've been hired by X entity, we work at the behest ostensibly of the full group. That doesn't mean any individual can just say, nope, we don't like this person anymore, but that there is a mechanism for the group to have a conversation if the person that they've brought in isn't trustworthy from their perspective, isn't helping them accomplish what they think they need to accomplish. So no silver bullets, but some ideas there.
Yeah, that's Dan. One thing I might add to that is also that the U.S. Institute for Environmental Conflict Resolution, or Oregon Consensus, or the Cater contract, what they have is they also have what are the facilitators' background, skills, experience, geographic location, a lot of those things that sometimes can help if you're trying to find a third-party neutral. If maybe there isn't somebody local, they can help you to find somebody that has maybe a cultural context or has worked in the area before or has certain skill sets. So a lot of these kind of rosters, if you will, are resources to help find somebody that might help that fit if they're not local. I'd throw that out there too.
And Dan, I would also add that sometimes not being local is really a strength. If you understand the issues and have worked in those topics before, so you're not a newbie to the interest, actually not being a community member can be a really great place to be from if you're trying to hold that neutral line.
You bet, you bet.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Susan. I guess I'd just say that, reading the question at least, I mean, I think it's partly a function, not only the external aspect, but if you've been brought in by the agency, and the agency, or whoever it is, if it's a particular landowner or something that brings you in, or whatever the case may be, but that they've made a decision that also kind of creates some of that challenge. But your point's, I think, well taken.
Well, and the idea that the group gets to have a say in who they work with, I think is really essential and important, that they buy off that this person is going to help them and that they have an opportunity to weigh in periodically.
Coordinated resource management plans are a great mechanism to do this. I've seen where the coordinated resource management plan, they form their leadership, and then they collaboratively go out and put out a solicitation for consultants or contractors to help, and then they as a group make that decision on who they want to come help them, kind of following the model you're talking about there, Paul. But any other thoughts on resources that folks listening today could utilize to get help with these things? Scott, maybe anything that your organization does to help out if somebody were to call up and say, hey, I've got a rangeland situation, where would you guys direct them?
Yeah, I mean, what we have done and what American Forest Resource Council has done, who I used to work for, is provide basically free legal help to folks that have been involved in the collaboratives to represent their interest in support of the project if litigation is filed. And So we're not mediators per se. We get involved as generally advocates representing somebody's interests, whether it be a county or a rancher or a timber person. But sometimes the county, the rancher, or the timber person is part of the collaborative, and the group is wanting to support that project, but doesn't have hasn't passed the hat to raise $25,000 to $50,000 to hire an attorney to get involved in the dispute and advocate to the judge that it's a good project that complied with the law. And so we will get involved at some point. And WRLC itself has a request for legal services to put together or to respond to individuals or collaboratives or whatever. And Western Resources Legal Center put together the amicus brief in this Mount Hood project long ago that was upheld by the court. There's a note in the chat that there's a recent decision out of the Ninth Circuit that shot down a project in Idaho that was part of a collaborative, and that certainly can happen. And the only way to address that would be to give some legislative support to say if the collaborative is comprised in this way, if this project is limited to this type of project and the outcome is a successful collaboration, there won't be any litigation, or in the case of this Montana litigation or legislation, that there'll be arbitration. So I'll stop there.
Okay, great. Let me just add that Karen on the chat says that the National Forest Foundation also provides neutral facilitation services and coaching/referrals on collaborative processes, particularly related to national forests and grasslands, and that they have an online resource library, and she gives the URL there. That's fantastic. Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges to so much of this stuff is that there are some tools and resources, but for some reason we don't share them enough. I think one of the biggest challenges to collaboration is that we often don't share our successes very much either. The Public Lands Council, I was attending their annual meeting last year, and some people were talking about suspended AUMs and a lot of frustration around that. So I raised my hand and I said, hey, are there examples of where people have had suspended AUMs restored? And the response was, oh yeah, there's actually a number of those. And I'm like, well, where are they? How do we learn about those stories, and how do we learn from those stories, or maybe increase our network of people we could call and ask how they did it or whatever? But it definitely seems like there is a ton of opportunities for us to share information, share successes, and help each other out more. All right, I'll get off that soapbox. Any other, Kevin, I don't know that I'm getting, I have some of the comments or questions. Paul read a couple of those, answered those. Also see this, this comment I just read from Karen. Are there any other ones that you've received that maybe I'm not seeing?
Yeah, I have one more that, there's one that I sent out to you that I think would be good to dig into, which is much of the conversation has focused on the collaborative relationship between agencies and the public, but conflict can often occur between agencies and different levels of government. What is the best way to address potential conflict between agencies that should, in theory, be on the same page?
That's a great question. Any of our panelists want to tackle that? I've got a couple thoughts, but let you guys go first.
I mean, I'll throw a couple of thoughts out. This is Paul, real quickly. I mean, one, I think this, just in the framing of this, it says between agencies and the public, and I don't mean to nitpick at all, obviously, but just to make sure there's a distinction between what I'm talking about generally, or most of this, and what I think most of this is agencies and other stakeholders. Agencies are stakeholders, obviously, as well. And obviously, to some extent, the public writ large is a stakeholder, but I wouldn't want to confuse what we're talking about with public involvement, public engagement, which is a related and important topic, but I think there's distinctions between what we're talking about and kind of more classic public engagement. But moving on to the issue of the conflict or differences of opinion between the agencies themselves, or I guess levels of government within agencies, that one is more OD work, right? Organizational development work. I'm not sure we want to jump too much in, I do at least, but in terms of conflict between agencies, I think the biggest challenge I've often found is that the agencies, when that has occurred, often want to resolve that on their own. They want to, they hesitate and generally dislike airing any dirty laundry, not only with the stakeholder community, but also even with their kind of facilitation team that's involved in the process whatever's being talked about. So, kind of educating them about the potential benefits, and this is where some of those things like, education of the range of tools can be valuable. Sometimes I think facilitators get pigeonholed into being facilitators of the collaborative engagement that's happening in a kind of a public-facing way, stakeholders and the agencies sometimes don't see that as a potential resource in a kind of more classic dispute resolution avenue between the agencies. So one thing is to do that and to provide them with examples or ideas of how you could be useful. The second piece I'd say, and then if Dan's got some thoughts, that'd be great, but is just that point about, stressing that the upward communication from participants in the process, that if agency folks that are engaged in the collaboration are disagreeing or have different opinions, that they are taking their concerns upward and looking for and creating those opportunities to bring their decision makers together to have those conversations. Often, if it can be facilitated or the facilitation team can be involved in, then that can be pretty helpful sometimes.
Excellent. What I would add to what Paul said is I think that idea of communicating up, that a lot of times there's a perception within agencies that escalation is failure. And I think a key thing at the very beginning of any collaborative process is to right up front be explicit and talk about that escalation is not failure, and that it is fully anticipated that at some point during the collaborative process there is going to need to be engagement of those executives, of those decision makers, to be able to flesh out maybe differences of policy or differences of opinion or different interpretations, and that it's totally okay to bring together those decision makers and cut to the chase. I think that's one of the things that led to us creating that 5 Ps model, is to be explicit about who those people are and who are they from each agency. The other thing that I would add to it is that it's absolutely essential that we have peer-to-peer collaboration at all 5 levels when you're doing multi-agency processes. Without that, I think you really are doomed to failure, or you're doomed to maybe not the best decision or action that could take place. Kevin, if you could real quick pull up slide number 5. One thing that I've learned in this by looking at some really great leaders on rangeland conflicts has been not only the assessment up front, but also this idea of having, being very explicit about each step of the project development. So it doesn't matter whatever processes you're developing, whether it's, a rangeland decision or a timber sale, whatever, it's the same idea of you're developing a project, right? So you have to identify the need, funding, planning, environmental design, construction, asset management. But what I've seen and had this idea of where agencies don't work together very well is that there's often turf war, sometimes within the agency, between planning and environmental and design. So if you go to the next slide, So this idea of being able to bookend the project development cycle with assessment on the front end, look at the risks, opportunities, what is the leader's intent, if there's multiple agencies involved, what is the intent from all the leaders of the agencies involved, but then bookending it with after-action reviews, I think is huge. And of course, this is scalable. So key milestones throughout doing these after-action reviews, where I really saw this work extremely well was in the sage grouse rollout 2 years ago. You had an acting director for Montana BLM from Arizona, Aiden, and Aiden, after the first day of those workshops with the rollout of the sage grouse plan, he then had everybody that was working on the team come back to the Forest Service. He actually had somebody that had no skin in the game as far as the process, which was a person on a detail from U.S. Fish and Wildlife, facilitate an after-action review. So what was the intent? Was the intent fulfilled? What were the lessons learned, and where do we need to make adaptation going forward? And it was fantastic. I do think key to a lot of these problems is that everybody is hungry for a framework to plug their problem into. And so whether it's something like this up on the screen or whatever works best for your situation, I think framing it and helping people to plug in the problem and then be able to talk about it is key. These after-action reviews, tons of people in the federal government are being trained in the PMP training model. That training model is heavily based on after-action reviews. I'd strongly encourage people to check that out. There's a ton of value in utilizing that. Sorry, that maybe went a little bit long. Any other thoughts? Or I guess we're at 12, or we're at 12:30 here, Mountain.
Yeah. Thanks, Dan. I think that this has been a really, really great discussion, but we do have to wrap up due to the time. I'm going to kick it over to Bill Whitaker for some closing comments.
Thanks, Kevin, and thank you to everybody for the participating today. That includes the moderator, the panelists, and the attendees. I think this was a really great discussion, so thank you, Dan, very much for moderating. I think that was a great conversation. I think you really led everyone along well, and also to Paul, Susan, and Scott. We definitely appreciate your insights on this. I think it was a very good discussion, and yeah, it's always interesting to talk about collaboratives and collaborations, that they were a major focus of the Forest and Rangeland Management Initiative, and I think one of the things we learned throughout that process is that they can be an excellent tool to improve project planning processes and decrease the risk of litigation and support and build support and participation in projects, but they also come with their own very unique set of challenges, and just and it was really good to try to address those today. It just came to mind that as you listen to everyone talk, a lot of it just comes down to relationships. The success of a lot of these and the success of a lot of projects come down to just human relationships and managing those and getting everyone on the same page. And human relationships are some of the most complicated things there are, so this work will never really be done. But I think we had a good conversation and really made some great groundwork and really set a great foundation for future conversations on this. So thank you, everyone, for watching and participating in this. And just for all the attendees, I'd like to thank you for sticking around and just let you know that this will be available. A recording of this will be available on the WGA website soon, so that is westgov.org. And I would just encourage everybody to watch it again. There's a lot of great content, and to share this with all of your contacts and share it widely. So thank you all. I think we had a great talk, and thanks for joining.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.